The English capital of London is one of the oldest cities in the modern world, with possible origins even predating the earliest Roman eras. The cobblestones lining its streets and the ancient trees looming over the greenery of its parks have been witness to all kinds of awful crimes and dark deeds across the centuries. From long before the time of London's most infamous murderer, Jack the Ripper, all the way to the heinous killer of today's podcast exclusive, a possible serial killer who, to this very day, remains unidentified. A cold case that has confounded authorities for the last 50 years and brings together two victims who, although far apart in life, were tragically united in death. The victims were a 21-year-old Playboy bunny hostessing the famous Mayfair Club and Casino, and a 16-year-old schoolgirl who was out celebrating the completion of her O-level exams with friends in Hounslow, West London. This is a truly criminal podcast exclusive. This is the case of Eve Stratford and Lynne Weedon. Part 1. Eve Stratford. Elizabeth Eve Stratford, or just Eve to her friends, was born on the 28th of December 1953 in Dortmund, Germany. Her father, Albert Stratford, was an army medic stationed with the occupying forces in the Royal Army Medical Corps after the chaos and devastation of the Second World War. It was while stationed in Dortmund that Albert met Elizabeth's mother, Liza, a beautiful local dressmaker who stole the young medic's heart. Eve certainly inherited her mother's beauty. As a child, she won a number of beauty competitions across Germany before she moved with her parents to Singapore, where she attended an international school with children of other military personnel stationed there. Because Albert was in the army, his job often took the family to far-flung areas of the globe, and Eve never really stayed anywhere long enough to call it home, although the friends she made in Singapore would still remember her very fondly many years later. As Eve reached adolescence, the family had to move again when Albert left the army and secured a position with the large British construction firm George Wimpey. They went to England and settled in Aldershot, Hampshire, and then for good in Warrington, Cheshire. Albert still had to spend long periods of time abroad for work and leave his family for weeks at a time. Due to her father's prolonged absences, Eve and her mother grew exceptionally close. The two were like best friends and shared a passion for fashion and cosmetics. But as they say, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and although Eve had that extremely close relationship with her mother, she was also really close to her dad, and the pair were very similar. Bitten by the travel bug due to her transient upbringing and fluent in both German and Russian, she soon grew bored of the routine humdrum of small-town suburbia and yearned to live somewhere else, London. With its vibrant atmosphere, multiculturalism and fashion-conscious crowds, London has long been a draw to young, outgoing and adventurous people from all over the UK, if not the entire world. Needless to say, it wasn't long before Eve packed her bags, kissed her parents goodbye, and at the age of just 19 relocated to the nation's capital. With dreams of making it as a model or glamour girl, she moved to the East London town of Leighton, and into a maisonette-style apartment her boyfriend Tony Priest shared with a few of his bandmates. Tony was the lead singer in a semi-successful psychedelic rock band called Onyx, who performed on Radio 1 numerous times, and had even opened for rock bands Queen and Thin Lizzy at one point. The lodging was far from glamorous. Eve shared an old mattress with Tony that was simply laid out on the floor as a makeshift bed, and the flat was cramped, but the 19-year-old was really happy. She was with the man she loved in the city she adored, and she set about making the less than glamorous property feel more like home, by decorating their bedroom with dried flowers that she brought from the florist, just outside Leytonstone tube station. Once in London, Eve soon caught the eye of the bosses of London's Park Lane Playboy Club and Casino, and after the recommendation of a friend, she quickly got a job waitressing tables and hostessing, whilst dressed in the iconic garb of the Playboy bunny, the legendary bunny ears and the fluffy pom-pom tail. It was while working at the famous Park Lane Club, which was the most successful casino in Europe at the time, that Eve took on the nicknames Eva von Bock and Bunny Eva. She rubbed elbows with a whole revelry of the rich and famous, ranging from well-known comedians like Eric Morecambe, from the popular Morecambe and Wise show and Carry On Sid James, to sports stars like boxer John Conte, and extremely wealthy sultans from the Middle East. However, as we've covered previously in our other Playboy podcast exclusives, the underbelly of the world of Playboy could be a seedy and dangerous one. Eve wasn't just mixing with celebrities and the rich and famous. She also found herself in with a landscape of fixers, pimps, drug dealers and corrupt police officers that frequented the club and casino. As of the writing of this podcast, it is not known how familiar Eve was with the less reputable aspects of the Playboy Club, but what is known for sure is that everyone who met Eve was simply enthralled by her. She was popular with all of the club's patrons and the staff, and everyone else that came into contact with her as well. Barbara Haig, a bunny girl at the Mayfair Club during the 1970s who knew Eve quite well, told a documentary filmmaker, "I was on the camera. I was camera bunny at the time, and she used to come and see me because she was very much a bunny and would like to be in Playboy magazine, very girly, very young, very naive, stars in her eyes." Her boyfriend Tony said that Eve was just very bubbly and always very friendly and always laughing. Just a really nice girl. We were planning to get married, actually. Eve's work at the Park Lane Casino would come to an abrupt end when a patron who worked as a fixer for the club's rich clientele burst into the club brandishing the new edition of Mayfair, an adult magazine and Playboy's largest UK rival. Eve was posed on the front cover and was also the magazine's Girl of the Month. She was brought into the manager's office straight away and immediately suspended for 3 months for breach of contract. Eve wasn't too perturbed by her situation. She had posed for the photographs after spending Christmas with her parents back in Warrington, and knew that the photographs would likely mean the end of her bunny girl career, but she had recently acquired an agent and wanted to be a model more than anything else in the world. After having her dreams shattered by being rejected by Playboy magazine, Eve was more than happy to pose for their rival Mayfair in the hopes that it would finally move her modelling career forward and give her the big break she so desperately yearned for. Erin Morris, the club's manager who had originally hired Eve and was the one who had suspended her, later told a journalist she wasn't upset. She understood what she'd done and why it had to happen. She told me she'd done it because she wanted to get into modelling. I said she could come back and work when the suspension was over. However, she anticipated this would be her step up the ladder, therefore she wouldn't need to come back. She wasn't just going to wait on tables, she wanted to do something with her life. Eve also posed for a second photo shoot. This time it was for the cover of a crime novel titled The Revenger Stainless Steel Wreath. Eve can be seen on the front cover of the paperback, screaming in pure terror, breasts exposed, as a faceless man throttles her from behind. On the 18th of March 1975, a chilly and snowy Tuesday morning, Eve woke up early at 7 and had breakfast with Tony, before he left at 7:30 for his job as a forklift truck driver. Around an hour and a half after that, at 9, the landlord came around to the flat to collect the weekly rent and chatted with Eve for a few minutes on the doorstep. She then got dressed and caught the train into Camden Town, where she met her agent for a little while, before heading over to Bayswater near Notting Hill for a meeting with a big-time promotions company. It was a busy morning for her, and as she headed home that day to 61A Lyndhurst Drive at around 3:30 that afternoon, it must have been extremely exciting knowing what kind of opportunities were available to her. She brought dried flowers from the florist as usual, and pulled down the brim of her brown hat that she was wearing against the bitterly cold wind as she started her walk home. She arrived at 10 minutes past 4. The hellish nightmare that awaited her in her flat would soon be splashed across every newspaper in the country. At around 4:30, a neighbour who lived on the floor below Eve and Tony told the authorities that she had heard a man and woman talking softly in the flat above, and then approximately 45 minutes after that, she said she had heard a loud banging sound on the floor, as though a chair had toppled over. The same neighbour then reported hearing footsteps walking down the side stairs of the maisonette and leaving via the front door of the building. At approximately 5:30, just 15 minutes after the loud bang was heard, Tony returned home with one of his bandmates and discovered the mutilated body of the girl he was planning to marry. He later said, "I came home from work, usual time, walked up the steps at the side, let myself in. I remember saying, 'Hey babe, I'm home,' and just silence. Walked up the stairs, straight ahead was the bedroom, and I walked into our bedroom and found Eve. The penny didn't fall first. I mean, she was laying face down with her head turned to the side. I thought, are you out of it? I got down on one knee and moved her hair back to see her face, and I've suddenly realised I was kneeling in a pool of blood, and then the penny dropped. And then I looked at her and I thought, fuck, you're dead, tied up with her throat cut. I can't describe it, it's just like, you're just confused, horror, you know? I can't imagine the terror she must have been in. That's one of the things which was apparent. Christ, this must have been bloody terrifying. She was such a soft person, just so sweet. She just absolutely didn't deserve that. But how? Who the hell did this?" Eve was found slumped next to the mattress that she shared with Tony, dressed only in pink underwear and a thin blue negligee. Her hands and legs were bound using a nylon stocking and scarf, both of which she had been wearing that day, and a belt from a nearby bathrobe had been tied tightly around her ankle. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed several times in the face and neck, and her throat had been slashed deeply from ear to ear, between 12 and 8 times. Experienced police officers who arrived at 61A Lyndhurst Drive that afternoon would later state that it was one of the most grotesque crime scenes they had ever witnessed. Eve's face had been mutilated and her throat wounds were so severe that she had almost been decapitated. The dried flowers she had been seen carrying on the way home that afternoon were later discovered lying by the door, leading investigators to believe that Eve had possibly been ambushed by the killer as she let herself into her home. Apart from the dropped flowers, there were no other visible signs of a struggle in the flat at all, and no defensive wounds on her body. This led investigators to speculate on whether Eve in fact knew her killer or not. Speculation on that subject continues to this day. The killer had acted coolly, seemingly making great efforts to leave no incriminating evidence behind. He had also taken the murder weapon, a very sharp knife, possibly a kitchen carving knife, away with him as he calmly left the scene. However, the culprit did leave something incriminating behind: male DNA. This was recovered from semen on the nylon stocking used to bind Eve's wrists, and from inside her body. The DNA would lead to a shocking breakthrough in the case decades later, which we will cover in part 2 of this special 2-part podcast exclusive. Albert, Eve's father, who was working in the Republic of the Congo at the time, was called back to England, only being told that his daughter had been hurt in an accident of some kind. It wasn't until he was picked up at the airport by a vehicle sent by his construction company that he learned of the awful truth from a 3-day-old tabloid newspaper that had been purposely left on the back seat. It had a picture of his daughter with the shocking headline, "Who Murdered Bunny Eva?" Albert spoke on a British television programme in 2007 about that day. "I was working in Zaire, and I was told my daughter had had an accident, so they flew me home. It was only when I got to London that there was a Sun newspaper with a photograph of my daughter, saying she'd been brutally murdered, and that was the first I'd heard about it. I had to go and identify the body because my wife couldn't do it. And that was the biggest shock of my life. Well, it destroyed the family." Erin Morris, the Playboy Club manager, remembered the moment Albert found out his daughter had been killed, and came to the club to search for some kind of answer as to what had happened. Erin said, "I remember one of the saddest things was the night her father arrived back from work. He wanted to speak to somebody in charge. He was crying. He couldn't understand what had happened and why. He said Eve was so happy working at Playboy. I remember we were all upset for him. It was awful. He'd only spoken to his daughter about 4 nights before, and naturally he was absolutely devastated. Liza, Eve's mother, was completely and utterly destroyed and never recovered from the tragic loss of her daughter. She fell into a deep depression, stopped going to work as a dressmaker at the little shop she had opened in London, and turned her home into a memorial for her daughter. One afternoon in 1986, Albert returned home from buying a few things from a local convenience store and found his wife dead on the living room floor. He said, "My wife never got over it and died. It's not often you see broken heart on a death certificate, but that's what's on my wife's death certificate." A full investigation into Eve's murder was immediately launched. Police officers and volunteers combed nearby parks, drains, allotments, and wasteland for any evidence that could be linked to the crime scene. Investigators knocked on doors all over the neighbourhood and questioned drivers who drove past Eve's house regularly. Her friends, co-workers, acquaintances were all interrogated by investigators, including Tony, who in the beginning was the detective's prime suspect. However, he was quickly cleared of suspicion and ruled out when his DNA didn't match the DNA left behind by the killer. He spoke about the fallout following Eve's death for the first time in a documentary, saying, "I remember being in a cell, and I spent the night in the cell, but of course the police don't know anything. It's up to me to tell my story. And then I've had to go and give blood because obviously they had semen samples, and my blood didn't match the semen sample, so it was obvious it wasn't me. I knew I had no guilt." Tony pointed the blame towards the man who had brought the newest issue of Mayfair magazine into the club that day and caused Eve's suspension. the man who was rumoured to be a pimp with associations to corrupt police detectives and London gangsters, who was also accused of trying to run Eve over with his car a week before her murder. However, this led nowhere, and the gentleman in question was proven innocent multiple times by the authorities, and again by his son posthumously decades later. The police searches all around Leighton turned up nothing substantial but a few old, mouldering pornographic magazines that were irrelevant to the case, despite Eve coincidentally being in one of them. Officers canvassing the neighbourhood did, however, come up with descriptions of two persons of interest, witnessed in the area at the time of Eve's murder. One was reportedly a man in his 30s or 40s with a strange loping walk and a red face, and the other was a curly-haired man of roughly the same age, seen loitering suspiciously in the area at the time of the murder. Photo fits were immediately made up of the two males, but like so many other promising leads in the case, they went nowhere substantial at all. Once her boyfriend and associates were cleared of suspicion, the investigators decided to focus on Eve's Mayfair centerfold, released just a few days prior to her death, believing that it was somehow connected to her murder. The contents of the article, where Eve spoke frankly about her sex life, reinforced many of the investigating officers' beliefs that the 21-year-old was killed because of her debut in the magazine. In the interview, which shocked her friends because the usually modest Eve stated she lived alone, when in fact she lived with her long-term boyfriend, and the way she was talking in a hypersexualized way that was obviously not like her real self at all. As one quote read, "I like to be dominated, not whipped and tied up or things like that, but just kept in my place. I get very bored with straight sex. I like playing little games with my lovers to turn us both on. I do tend to flirt and tease rather a lot. I just get a kick out of turning men on." It was quotes like this, alongside the erotic photographs of her, that led investigators to speculate on the possible scenario that she had been followed home that day from the train station by a stalker who had become obsessed with her centerfold, ambushed as she opened the front door and, fearing for her life, had gone along with the demands of her attacker in the desperate hope of either being spared death or stalling the attacker long enough until Tony arrived home. These speculations were only strengthened further once detectives discovered that Eve had reportedly received multiple menacing phone calls right up until the very day she was killed. The caller had either used repulsive language down the line or remained silent for a few minutes, only breathing heavily before hanging up. By the time autumn of that year had begun to creep in, police were now running low on leads and resources to keep her case going. As newer cases began to pour in from all over London, the investigation began to grow cold. Just another one of the great metropolis's unsolved crimes. Desperate for answers, Albert even visited the infamous London gangster Reggie Cray in prison, in the hope that the convicted mobster with his contacts might be able to aid the investigation somehow. Albert later said, "When these things happen to you, you say, 'If there's a God up there, please don't let it happen to anyone else.'" However, as Eve's case slowly disappeared from the headlines and the investigation started to fade away, her killer wasn't finished. He came out of the shadows once again in September of 1975. This time the victim was Lynne Weedon, a shy 16-year-old girl, out enjoying the completion of her O-level exams with friends. The two murders would not be linked until 2007, when advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to finally connect two of London's most heinous crimes together and breathe new life into Eve's investigation. A £40,000 reward was offered up at the time for any information that led to the capture of Eve's killer, but as of the writing of this podcast, it remains unclaimed. Albert stated in 2007, "I was hoping I would be a granddad, but I wasn't, so the whole family's gone. When I've gone, the whole family's gone, so I just hope that before I do, the police, bless them, find out what's happened, who did it and why." Tragically, Eve's father Albert, the last surviving member of his family, passed away still desperately seeking those answers, as did her boyfriend Tony, who moved abroad after Eve's murder and ended his life by voluntary euthanasia after suffering from a long-term illness. The lead investigator on Eve's case, Detective Chief Inspector Noel McHugh, said, "It's inconceivable that the killer of Eve and Lynne has kept the perfect secret for 40 years. It's a heavy burden to carry, and he must have let details slip over the years, maybe to a partner, a friend, even a cellmate, and I would appeal to anyone with information to contact us." He went on to state he believes the killer is likely a Caucasian male, now in his 60s or 70s. Eve's gravestone in Christchurch has been vandalised and her grave desecrated numerous times since her funeral in 1975. but in a testament to how much she meant to those she met. The friends she had made all those years ago in Singapore clubbed together to raise funds for a new gravestone and the further upkeep of the cemetery. The murder of Eve broke the hearts and destroyed the lives of those who knew and loved her. When the killer took her life that day, the ramifications were so far-reaching it's impossible to properly comprehend. Please tune into part 2 of this special, where we look at the second victim, Lynne Weedon, and the continuation of this mysterious and devastating unsolved case. We truly hope that this killer is brought to justice soon, and anyone with any information on Eve's case can call Crime Stoppers anonymously on 0800 555 111.